The Astral Empire's reach stretched across countless star systems, its influence extending far beyond the confines of its capital world. It had amassed vast wealth and military might through ruthless conquest and cunning political maneuvering. Yet, for all its grandeur, a dark undercurrent of corruption festered within the halls of power. At the heart of this vast interstellar dominion sat the Galactic Council, a shadowy cabal of the Empire's most influential figures. They wielded absolute control, manipulating events and suppressing dissent to maintain their iron grip on the populace. To them, the concept of democracy was an antiquated relic, a weakness to be exploited rather than a virtue to be upheld. Representative Alice Washington, a charismatic and principled diplomat, had long been a thorn in the Council's side. Hailing from the human colony of New Horizon, she had risen through the ranks, becoming a fierce advocate for the rights of her people. Her unwavering commitment to justice and transparency threatened to expose the Council's dark secrets, a prospect they could not abide. As Alice stood before the Council, her piercing gaze met the cold, calculating eyes of the Empire's ruling elite. She knew the risks she was taking, but her sense of duty compelled her to forge ahead, undaunted by the political machinations that swirled around her. "You cannot continue to exploit the colonies for your own gain," she declared, her voice firm and unyielding. "The people deserve a fair and representative government, not the self-serving tyranny of a privileged few." The Council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions betraying a glimmer of unease. They were not accustomed to being challenged so boldly, especially by a mere colonial representative. "Your concerns are noted, Representative Washington," one of the Council members, Madame Evelyn, responded in a measured tone. "However, you fail to understand the complexities of governing an empire of this scale. Sacrifices must be made for the greater good of the Astral Empire." Alice's eyes narrowed. "Sacrifices? You mean the exploitation of our resources, the suppression of dissent, and the disproportionate suffering of the colonies. That is not for the greater good. It is the pursuit of power at the expense of the people you are sworn to serve." Tension hung thick in the air as the Council members exchanged uneasy glances. They knew that Alice's words, though inflammatory, held a grain of truth. The Empire's expansion had come at a heavy cost, with the colonies bearing the brunt of the burden while the capital world reaped the benefits. Madame Evelyn's expression hardened. "You speak out of turn, Representative Washington. Your idealism is commendable, but it is ultimately misguided. The Astral Empire has brought stability and prosperity to countless worlds. We will not allow your reckless actions to jeopardize that. Stability built on the backs of the oppressed," Alice retorted, her voice rising in anger. "I will not be silenced, not when the lives of my people hang in the balance. The time has come for the Council to be held accountable for its crimes." The Council members shifted uncomfortably, their expressions darkening. They knew that Alice's words resonated with the people, and her growing influence posed a genuine threat to their hold on power. Madame Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Representative Washington, you are treading a dangerous path. We have been patient, but your continued defiance will not be tolerated. I urge you to reconsider your position before you find yourself in a most unfortunate situation." Alice held the Council members' gaze, unflinching. "I will not back down, not when the future of the colonies hangs in the balance. The people deserve better, and I will fight for that future, no matter the cost." The Council chambers erupted into a heated debate as the representatives argued and posturing, each side unwilling to concede ground. Alice stood her ground, her resolve unwavering, knowing full well that she had crossed a line that the Council would not easily forgive. As the meeting drew to a close, Madame Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her expression inscrutable. "Very well, Representative Washington. You have made your position clear. I hope, for your sake, that you are prepared to face the consequences of your actions." Alice's heart raced, but she refused to be cowed. "I am," she replied, her voice steady, "and I will continue to fight for the rights of my people, no matter what you may try to do." With those parting words, Alice turned and strode from the council chambers, her head held high. She knew that she had struck a blow against the Empire's corruption, but the road ahead would be fraught with peril. The council would not take her defiance lightly, and she braced herself for the retribution that was sure to follow. As she walked through the gleaming corridors of the Astral Empire's capital, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The weight of her decision bore down on her, but she refused to be intimidated. She would continue to fight, to expose the truth and secure a better future for her people, no matter the cost. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of the Astral Empire, and Alice Washington was determined to be at the forefront of the battle. The corridors of the Astral Empire's capital were eerily quiet as the elite team of assassins made their way towards Representative Alice Washington's residence. Their movements were fluid, their expressions devoid of emotion. Trained killers on a mission to eliminate a target deemed a threat to the Council's stranglehold on power. The assassins knew their task was to leave no trace, to make the representative's death appear as an unfortunate accident. They had rehearsed the operation meticulously, anticipating every possible contingency. Tonight, their meticulous planning would be put to the test. As they approached the guarded entrance to Alice's apartment, the team leader raised a hand, signaling his comrades to halt. With a quick glance, he assessed the situation, noting the two armed security personnel stationed at the door. A barely perceptible nod was all it took, and in a flash, the assassins sprang into action. The first guard never saw it coming, a swift strike to the throat cutting off his cry for help. The second managed to draw his sidearm, but a hail of precision shots felled him before he could squeeze the trigger. The corridor was once again shrouded in an eerie silence, save for the faint sounds of labored breathing. The assassins swiftly moved to secure the entrance, dispatching the remaining security personnel with ruthless efficiency. Within minutes, they had breached the apartment, their weapon sights trained on the unsuspecting representative. Alice Washington sat at her desk, oblivious to the impending danger. She was engrossed in reviewing a stack of reports, her brow furrowed in concentration. Suddenly, the sound of a door opening shattered the stillness, and she looked up, a startled expression crossing her features. Before she could react, the assassins opened fire, a barrage of plasma bolts searing through the air. Alice's body jerked as the round struck, and she crumpled to the ground, her life snuffed out in an instant. The assassins paused, quickly surveying the scene to ensure their target was neutralized. Satisfied, they began the grim task of staging the crime scene, meticulously arranging the environment to create the illusion of an accidental fire. As they worked, a sense of unease crept into the back of their minds. The representative's death, though necessary, felt hollow, a mere transaction in the Council's grand scheme. They knew they were but pawns in a much larger game, their loyalty unquestioned, but their role ultimately expendable. With a final glance, the lead assassin signaled to his team, and they swiftly exited the apartment, leaving no trace of their involvement. Their mission was complete, but the ripples of their actions would soon be felt across the Empire. News of Representative Alice Washington's death spread like wildfire through the human colonies, igniting a wave of outrage and disbelief. The people had lost a beloved leader, a champion of their rights, and a voice of reason in a world increasingly dominated by the Astral Empire's ruthless agenda. Across the colonies, protests erupted, with citizens taking to the streets to demand answers and justice. The Council's attempt to silence Alice had backfired spectacularly, galvanizing the populace and emboldening those who had long chafed under the Empire's oppressive rule. Sarah Washington, Alice's daughter, stood at the forefront of the burgeoning resistance. Grief-stricken but resolute, she vowed to uncover the truth behind her mother's death and hold the Council accountable for their actions. Her impassioned calls for justice resonated with the people, who saw in her the same unwavering spirit that had defined her mother's legacy. They thought they could silence her, that they could extinguish the flame of hope she had kindled in our hearts, Sarah declared, her voice carrying across the crowded plaza. But they were wrong. My mother's memory burns brighter than ever, and we will not rest until those responsible for her murder are brought to justice." The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, their cries of anger and determination echoing through the streets. The council's calculated gambit had backfired, and they now faced the prospect of a full-scale uprising, one that threatened to tear the empire apart at its very seams. In the Astral Empire's capital, the council members convened in a hastily called emergency session, their faces etched with a mixture of concern and frustration. Madame Evelyn, the architect of the plan to eliminate Alice Washington, now found herself grappling with the consequences of her actions. "This was not supposed to happen," she hissed, her usually calm demeanor crumbling. The representative's death was meant to be a surgical strike, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the empire. Instead, we are faced with a growing and increasingly volatile rebellion. The other council members shifted uncomfortably, their expressions mirroring Evelyn's distress. They had not anticipated the depth of the people's attachment to Alice, nor the intensity of the backlash that would follow her demise. "We must act swiftly to quell this unrest before it spirals out of control," one of the council members, Kiran, interjected. "Deploy the military, crush any signs of dissent, and make an example of those who dare to challenge our authority." Evelyn nodded, her eyes narrowing. "So be it. The Astral Empire will not be held hostage by the whims of the masses. We will do what is necessary to maintain order, even if it means resorting to extreme measures." As the council members debated their course of action, the flames of rebellion continued to spread, fueled by the outrage and grief of the people. The Astral Empire was on the brink of a reckoning, one that would test the limits of its power and the resolve of those who dared to stand against it. The news of Representative Alice Washington's death rippled through the human colonies like a shockwave, igniting a wave of outrage and disbelief. For the people, it was a devastating blow, the loss of a beloved leader and a champion of their rights. But beneath the grief, a spark of defiance began to flicker. Across the colony worlds, protests erupted as citizens took to the streets, demanding answers and justice. Sarah Washington, Alice's daughter, emerged as the face of the growing resistance. Grief-stricken but resolute, she vowed to uncover the truth behind her mother's murder and hold the Astral Empire's council accountable for their actions. They thought they could silence her, that they could extinguish the flame of hope she had kindled in our hearts, Sarah declared, her voice carrying across the crowded plaza. But they were wrong. My mother's memory burns brighter than ever, and we will not rest until those responsible for her murder are brought to justice." The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, their cries of anger and determination echoing through the streets. The council's calculated gambit had backfired, and they now faced the prospect of a full-scale uprising, one that threatened to tear the empire apart at its very seams. As the protests continued to gain momentum, rebel factions seized the opportunity to challenge the Astral Empire's authority. Inspired by Sarah's unwavering call to action, they launched coordinated attacks on key outposts and infrastructure, disrupting the flow of resources and communication across the colonies. The Astral Empire's response was swift and uncompromising. Madame Evelyn, the council member responsible for orchestrating Alice's assassination, convened an emergency session, her usually calm demeanor crumbling under the weight of the crisis. "This was not supposed to happen," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. The representative's death was meant to be a surgical strike, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the empire. Instead, we are faced with a growing and increasingly volatile rebellion. The other council members shifted uncomfortably, their expressions mirroring Evelyn's distress. They had not anticipated the depth of the people's attachment to Alice, nor the intensity of the backlash that would follow her demise. "We must act swiftly to quell this unrest before it spirals out of control," Kiran, another council member, interjected. "Deploy the military, crush any signs of dissent, and make an example of those who dare to challenge our authority." Evelyn nodded, her eyes narrowing. "So be it. The Astral Empire will not be held hostage by the whims of the masses. We will do what is necessary to maintain order, even if it means resorting to extreme measures. As the council members debated their course of action, the flames of rebellion continued to spread across the colonies. Inspired by Sarah's call to arms, rebel factions launched a series of coordinated attacks, targeting the Empire's infrastructure and communication networks. In the capital city, the streets echoed with the sound of marching boots as the Astral Empire's military forces mobilized to crush the uprising. Heavily armored vehicles rumbled through the streets, their weapons bristling with deadly intent. Sarah Washington stood at the forefront of the rebel forces, her eyes burning with a determined fire. She had assembled a ragtag army of disgruntled colonists, each one fueled by a deep-seated anger towards the Astral Empire's oppressive rule. They may have the numbers and the firepower, but we have something they can never defeat: the unbreakable spirit of the people, Sarah declared, her voice rising above the din of the battle. We fight not for ourselves, but for the legacy of our mothers and fathers, and for the future of our children. We will not be silenced, not while a single breath remains in our lungs. The rebels surged forward, their crude but deadly weapons striking at the Imperial forces. Plasma bolts and shrapnel filled the air, as the two sides clashed in a brutal display of raw power. The Astral Empire's troops, trained for conventional warfare, found themselves at a disadvantage against the rebels' guerrilla tactics. As the battle raged on, Sarah Washington led her forces in a daring assault on a key Imperial outpost. The facility was a vital hub for the Empire's communication and logistics networks, and its capture would deal a significant blow to the Astral Empire's ability to coordinate its response. The rebels stormed the outpost, their weapons blazing as they overwhelmed the surprised Imperial forces. Sarah herself led the charge, her eyes narrowed with determination as she fought her way through the chaos. In the council chambers, Madame Evelyn watched the unfolding events with growing concern. The rebels had managed to infiltrate and seize control of a critical installation, a development that threatened to undermine the Empire's grip on the colonies. Unacceptable, Evelyn hissed, her fists clenching. Dispatch the elite shock troops immediately. I want that outpost reclaimed, and I want the rebels crushed under the full might of the Astral Empire. The council members exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on their minds. They had not foreseen the depth of the people's resolve, nor the strategic acumen of the rebel forces. The Astral Empire's dominance was being challenged, and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. As the battle for the outpost raged on, Sarah Washington knew that the stakes had never been higher. The fate of the colonies hung in the balance, and she was determined to see her mother's legacy through, no matter the cost. For Alice, she cried, her voice carrying across the battlefield as the rebels surged forward, their battle cries echoing through the night. The Astral Empire scrambled to contain the growing unrest that had erupted across the colonies following the assassination of Representative Alice Washington. Madame Evelyn, the council member responsible for orchestrating the deadly plot, ordered the deployment of the Empire's formidable military forces to quell the burgeoning rebellion. Legions of highly trained Imperial troops, equipped with the latest in advanced weaponry, converged on the sites of the largest protests and rebel-held strongholds. Their mission was clear: crush the dissent, make an example of the ringleaders, and restore the Empire's iron grip on the colonies. However, the rebel forces, inspired by Sarah Washington's unwavering leadership, proved to be more organized and determined than the Empire had anticipated. Rather than engaging the superior Imperial forces in open combat, they employed a series of guerrilla tactics that played to their strengths. Ambushes, sabotage, and lightning-fast strikes on vulnerable supply lines and communication hubs crippled the Empire's ability to coordinate its response. The rebels seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, their movements guided by intimate knowledge of the terrain and the support of the local populace. As the battles raged on, the body count on both sides began to mount. The Imperial troops, trained for conventional warfare, struggled to adapt to the rebels' unconventional methods. Their superior firepower and numbers were often rendered meaningless in the chaos of the urban skirmishes, and hit-and-run operations. Sarah Washington, her eyes narrowed with determination, led her forces from the front, her tactical acumen and fearless resolve inspiring the rebels to ever greater acts of bravery. She knew that the path ahead would be treacherous, but the memory of her mother's sacrifice fueled her unwavering commitment to the cause. "We will not be broken," she cried, her voice ringing out across the battlefield. "The Astral Empire may have the might, but we have the will to fight for our freedom, for the legacy of those who have come before us." The rebels' resilience and adaptability soon began to take a toll on the Imperial forces. Caught off guard by the unpredictable nature of the rebel attacks, the military leadership found themselves struggling to maintain control of the situation. Madame Evelyn, her brow furrowed with frustration, convened an emergency session of the council to discuss the escalating crisis. The other members, their expressions grim, listened intently as she outlined the gravity of the situation. "The rebels are proving to be a far more formidable adversary than we anticipated," Evelyn admitted, her voice laced with a rare hint of uncertainty. "Their tactics are disrupting our supply lines, hampering our ability to coordinate a coherent response. We are losing ground, and the situation is only growing more dire." One of the council members, Kiran, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Then we must take more decisive action. These rebels are a threat to the stability of the Empire. They must be crushed, no matter the cost." Evelyn nodded, her expression hardening. "I agree. We can no longer afford to hold back. Authorize the deployment of our most advanced weaponry, orbital bombardments, bioengineered super soldiers, whatever it takes to regain control of the situation." The other council members exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to voice their dissent. They understood the gravity of the situation, and the prospect of the Empire's downfall was unthinkable. Reluctantly, they acquiesced to Evelyn's demands, granting her the authority to take the gloves off. As the Imperial forces received the order to escalate their tactics, the rebels braced themselves for the coming onslaught. Sarah Washington, her eyes gleaming with determination, rallied her troops, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. "They may have the firepower, but we have the spirit," she declared, her voice carrying across the gathered rebels. "We will not be cowed by their threats, nor will we back down in the face of their overwhelming might. We fight for our freedom, for the future of our people, and no amount of Imperial might can break our resolve." The rebels roared their approval, their weapons raised high as they prepared to meet the Empire's onslaught head-on. They knew that the battle ahead would be the fiercest they had faced yet, but their determination to see Alice's legacy through was unwavering. As the Imperial forces moved in, the rebels braced themselves for the coming storm. The air crackled with tension, and the ground trembled beneath the weight of the advancing troops. Sarah Washington, her heart pounding, took a deep breath and steeled herself for the fight of her life. "For Alice," she cried, her voice echoing across the battlefield as the two sides collided in a violent clash of steel and fury. The rebels fought with every ounce of their being, their weapons blazing as they sought to hold back the Imperial onslaught. But the Empire's forces were relentless, their advanced technology and sheer numbers slowly overwhelming the rebel defenses. Sarah Washington, her clothing torn and her face streaked with grime, continued to rally her troops, her voice never wavering. She knew that the fate of the colonies hung in the balance, and she was determined to see her mother's sacrifice honored, no matter the cost. As the battle raged on, the skies above the rebel stronghold suddenly erupted in a blinding display of light and fire. Massive plasma cannons, mounted on the Empire's towering orbital platforms, rained destruction down upon the rebels, their devastating firepower tearing through the makeshift fortifications. The rebels scattered, their ranks thrown into disarray as they sought cover from the withering barrage. Sarah Washington, her eyes wide with horror, watched as her comrades were cut down one by one, their bodies consumed by the intense heat and energy of the orbital bombardment. In that moment, she knew that the rebels were outmatched, their courage and determination no match for the sheer, overwhelming might of the Astral Empire. But even as the flames licked at the edges of her vision, Sarah's resolve did not falter. She would fight on, no matter the cost, for the sake of her mother's memory and the freedom of her people. With a grim determination, she rallied the remnants of her forces, preparing to make one final desperate stand against the Imperial juggernaut. As the Astral Empire's devastating orbital bombardment rained destruction upon the rebel stronghold, the people of the colonies watched in horror, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and burning anger. The brutal assault had thrown the rebel forces into disarray, shattering their defenses and cutting down their comrades with merciless efficiency. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah Washington stood her ground, her eyes narrowed with determination. She had witnessed firsthand the terrifying might of the Astral Empire's military machine, and yet her resolve remained unbroken. The memory of her mother's sacrifice fueled her unwavering commitment to the cause of freedom. Rallying the scattered remnants of her forces, Sarah made a desperate gambit, a bold plan to strike at the heart of the Astral Empire's power. If the rebels could not prevail through conventional means, then she would find another way to challenge the Council's stranglehold on power. "We may be outmatched, but we are not beaten," Sarah declared, her voice ringing out over the din of the battle. "The Astral Empire has shown us their true face, their willingness to crush us with overwhelming force. But we will not be cowed, not when the future of our people hangs in the balance." The rebels, their spirits lifted by Sarah's words, readied themselves for the perilous mission ahead. They knew the risks, the likelihood of their success seeming remote in the face of the Empire's might. And yet, they were driven by a deeper purpose, a desire to honor the legacy of those who had come before them, and to forge a better future for their children. As the rebel forces stealthily made their way towards the Astral Empire's capital, Sarah Washington steeled herself for the confrontation that lay ahead. She had come this far, driven by the memory of her mother's murder and the injustice that had sparked the rebellion. Now, she stood on the precipice of a showdown that would determine the fate of the colonies and the Astral Empire itself. In the council chambers of the Astral Empire, Madame Evelyn paced back and forth, her brow furrowed with a mixture of triumph and unease. The orbital bombardment had succeeded in crushing the rebel stronghold, but the embers of dissent continued to smolder across the colonies. "We have delivered a decisive blow," Evelyn declared, addressing the other council members. "The rebels have been put on the defensive, their momentum broken. Now is the time to press our advantage and crush this uprising once and for all." Kiran, the council member who had advocated for the use of extreme measures, nodded in agreement. "I concur. The people have seen the true might of the Astral Empire, and they will think twice before challenging our authority again. We must seize this opportunity to make an example of the rebel leaders and remind the colonies of the consequences of defiance." The other council members exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions betraying a hint of discomfort. While they acknowledged the tactical merits of Evelyn and Kiran's proposal, they could not ignore the growing unrest among the populace. The people's thirst for justice and freedom had proven to be a powerful force, one that threatened to tear the empire apart if left unchecked. "We must tread carefully," one of the council members, Aisha, cautioned. "The people's anger burns brighter than ever, and we risk inciting further unrest if we resort to heavy-handed tactics. Perhaps we should consider a more measured approach, one that addresses their grievances and restores a sense of stability." Evelyn's lips thinned into a tight-lipped frown. "Stability? At the expense of our authority? No, we cannot afford to appear weak or conciliatory. The Astral Empire's power must be reaffirmed, no matter the cost." As the council members debated their course of action, Sarah Washington and her rebel forces were closing in on the capital, their determination fueled by a desire for justice and retribution. They knew that the path ahead would be treacherous, but the memory of Alice's sacrifice compelled them onward. Slipping past the formidable security measures and the ever-vigilant eyes of the Imperial troops, the rebels infiltrated the heart of the Astral Empire's power. Sarah led her team with a calm, calculated precision, her senses heightened and her resolve unwavering. Moments later, They stood before the council chambers, the guards stationed outside swiftly overwhelmed by the rebels' relentless assault. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation that lay ahead, and then pushed open the doors, striding into the chamber with a grim determination. The council members, caught off guard by the brazen intrusion, scrambled to their feet, their expressions a mix of shock and outrage. Madame Evelyn, her eyes wide with alarm, opened her mouth to call for reinforcements, but Sarah's voice cut her off, ringing out with a clarity that silenced the chamber. "Your reign of terror ends today, Evelyn," Sarah declared, her eyes burning with a righteous fury. "You and your co-conspirators are responsible for the murder of my mother, the Astral Empire's own representative. And now you will face the consequences of your actions." Evelyn's face contorted with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You dare to storm the heart of the Astral Empire, child. This is an act of treason that will not be tolerated. Your rebellion will be crushed, and your mother's memory will be forgotten." Sarah's lips curled into a humorless smile. "We shall see about that, Evelyn. For too long, the Astral Empire has ruled with an iron fist, crushing the dreams and aspirations of the people. But today, the tide is turned. Justice will be served, and the truth will be revealed, no matter the cost." With those words, Sarah and the rebel forces surged forward, their weapons raised and their determination unwavering. The confrontation that would decide the fate of the Astral Empire had begun. As the rebel forces stormed the council chambers of the Astral Empire's capital, Madame Evelyn and her fellow council members found themselves caught off guard by the brazen assault. The sound of blaster fire echoed through the ornate halls as Sarah Washington and her determined comrades fought to breach the heart of the Empire's power. Evelyn's face contorted with a mix of fear and defiance as she realized the gravity of the situation. "You dare to storm the very seat of the Astral Empire's authority," she growled, her eyes narrowing. "This act of treason will not be tolerated. Your rebellion will be crushed, and your mother's memory will be forgotten." Sarah's lips curled into a humorless smile. "We shall see about that, Evelyn. For too long, the Astral Empire has ruled with an iron fist, crushing the dreams and aspirations of the people. But today, the tide is turned. Justice will be served, and the truth will be revealed, no matter the cost." With those words, Sarah and the rebel forces surged forward, their weapons blazing as they sought to overwhelm the council members and their elite security detail. The air crackled with the sound of plasma bolts and the shouts of combatants as the two sides clashed in a desperate struggle for control of the chamber. Evelyn and her fellow counselors scrambled to escape the onslaught, their faces etched with a mixture of panic and fury. They had not anticipated the rebels' audacity, nor the fierce determination that fueled their assault. The Astral Empire's vaunted security measures seemed to crumble in the face of the rebel onslaught. As the battle raged on, Sarah Washington fought her way through the chaos, her eyes locked on Evelyn's retreating form. She was driven by a burning desire for vengeance, a need to confront the woman who had orchestrated her mother's murder and shatter the illusion of the Astral Empire's invincibility. Pushing past the Imperial Guards, Sarah finally cornered Evelyn, her weapon trained on the council member's cowering form. "It ends here, Evelyn," she hissed, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Confess your crimes, and maybe I'll make your death quick." Evelyn's eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for an avenue of escape. "You foolish girl," she spat. "Do you really think your petty rebellion can topple the might of the Astral Empire? We are the pillars that hold this civilization together, and we will not be brought down by the whims of the masses." Sarah's expression hardened. "Then you leave me no choice." She prepared to pull the trigger, her resolve unwavering. But before she could act, a deafening explosion rocked the council chambers, sending debris and shrapnel flying in all directions. Sarah was thrown off balance, her weapon clattering to the floor as she struggled to regain her footing. Seizing the opportunity, Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her robes billowing as she fled the chamber, her security detail providing a hasty escort. "You may have won this skirmish, But the Astral Empire will not be vanquished so easily, she called out over her shoulder, her voice laced with a hint of triumph. As the dust settled, Sarah Washington and her rebel comrades surveyed the devastation, their hearts sinking as they realized the full extent of the Empire's retaliation. The chamber had been ravaged by a series of powerful explosions, and many of their allies lay wounded or worse, their sacrifice a testament to the brutal lengths the Astral Empire would go to maintain its grip on power. Clutching her injured arm, Sarah turned to her second-in-command, a resolute determination burning in her eyes. "They've shown their true colors," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Now it's time for us to show them ours." Outside the council chambers, the Astral Empire's military forces had mobilized, their ranks swelling with reinforcements as they prepared to crush the rebel incursion. Armored vehicles rumbled through the streets, their weapons bristling with deadly intent, while elite squadrons of bioengineered super soldiers marched in lockstep, their enhanced strength and reflexes a terrifying sight to behold. Madame Evelyn, her composure regained, stood at the center of the military command, her expression hardening as she surveyed the scene. "The rebels have had their moment of triumph," she declared, her voice cutting through the din of activity. "Now, it is time to show them the true might of the Astral Empire." With a curt nod, she dispatched the elite shock troops, their mission to reclaim the council chambers and eliminate the rebel presence in the capital. The soldiers moved with a cold, unwavering efficiency, their weapons charged and their resolve unbreakable. As the rebel forces braced themselves for the impending onslaught, Sarah Washington knew that they were outmatched, their courage and determination no match for the sheer, overwhelming power of the Astral Empire. And yet, she refused to surrender, her mother's memory spurring her onward. "We fight for our freedom, for the future of our people," she cried, rallying her comrades. "The Astral Empire may have the numbers and the firepower, but we have something they can never defeat: the unbreakable spirit of the masses." The rebels roared their approval, their weapons raised high as they prepared to meet the Imperial forces head-on. They knew the risks, the likelihood of their success seeming remote in the face of the Empire's might. And yet they were driven by a deeper purpose, a desire to honor the legacy of those who had come before them, and to forge a better future for their children. As the two armies clashed in a brutal display of raw power, the streets of the Astral Empire's capital became a battlefield, the fate of the colonies hanging in the balance. The streets of the Astral Empire's capital had become a raging battlefield as the rebel forces, led by Sarah Washington, clashed with the elite shock troops dispatched by the council. The air crackled with the sound of plasma bolts and the thunderous rumble of armored vehicles as the two sides engaged in a desperate struggle for control of the city. Outmatched by the sheer might of the Imperial forces, the rebels fought with a fierce determination that belied their numerical disadvantage. They knew that the fate of the colonies hung in the balance, and they were driven by a deep-seated desire to honor the legacy of those who had come before them. Sarah Washington, her eyes narrowed with grim resolve, rallied her comrades, her voice rising above the din of battle. "They may have the numbers and the firepower, but we have something they can never defeat: the unbreakable spirit of the people," she cried, her words inspiring the rebels to ever greater acts of bravery. Surging forward, the rebels unleashed a barrage of attacks, targeting the Imperial forces' vulnerable supply lines and communication hubs. Their guerrilla tactics, honed through weeks of grueling conflict, proved to be a formidable challenge for the shock troops, who had been trained for conventional warfare. As the battle raged on, the streets of the capital became a chaotic patchwork of clashing forces, with each side fighting for every inch of ground. The rebels, their numbers dwindling but their resolve unyielding, refused to be cowed by the Empire's overwhelming might. Sarah Washington, her clothes torn and her face streaked with grime, led her battered but unbowed troops in a daring assault on the council chambers, determined to confront the very heart of the Astral Empire's power. With a fury born of grief and righteous anger, she fought her way through the Imperial lines, her weapon blazing as she carved a path towards her ultimate goal. As she neared the council chambers, Sarah caught a glimpse of Madame Evelyn, the architect of her mother's assassination, fleeing the scene with her personal security detail. A surge of pure rage coursed through her veins, and without a moment's hesitation, she gave chase, her eyes locked on her target. Evelyn, realizing she was being pursued, frantically barked orders into her communicator, her expression one of pure panic. "Dispatch the bioengineered super soldiers. I want that girl captured, alive if possible, but neutralized at all costs." In response to Evelyn's command, a squad of towering, genetically enhanced warriors emerged from the shadows, their movements fluid and their expressions devoid of emotion. These were the Astral Empire's most deadly enforcers, trained to eliminate any threat to the Council's power with ruthless efficiency. Sarah skidded to a halt, her heart pounding as she confronted the imposing figures. She knew that she and her comrades were no match for these enhanced soldiers, but her determination to see justice done outweighed her fear. "For Alice," she cried, her voice ringing out with a defiant resolve, as she charged headlong into the fray, her weapon blazing. The battle that ensued was a brutal display of raw power, with the rebels unleashing everything they had in a desperate attempt to overwhelm the super soldiers. But the enhanced warriors, their reflexes lightning fast and their strength seemingly superhuman, shrugged off the rebels' attacks with ease, systematically cutting them down one by one. Sarah fought with a ferocity born of grief and rage, her blows landing with a devastating impact. But even as she pushed the super soldiers back, she realized that her efforts were ultimately futile. The Empire's elite enforcers were simply too powerful, too relentless to be stopped by conventional means. As she felt her strength waning, Sarah's gaze locked with Evelyn's, the council member's expression a twisted mixture of triumph and fear. "It's over, girl," Evelyn hissed, her voice dripping with contempt. "Your mother's memory will be forgotten, and the Astral Empire will continue to thrive, with or without your interference." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Never," she spat, her grip tightening on her weapon. "As long as I draw breath, the Astral Empire will never know true peace. The people will rise up, and your tyranny will be swept away." Evelyn's lips curled into a sneer. "Then you will be the first to fall." With a curt nod, she signaled the super soldiers to move in for the kill. As the enhanced warriors closed in, Sarah knew that her end was near. But even in the face of certain death, her resolve did not waver. She would fight to the last, determined to honor her mother's memory, and to inspire the people to continue the fight for freedom. With a defiant cry, she launched herself at the super soldiers, her weapon blazing, her movements a blur of desperation and fury. The battle that ensued was a violent clash of steel and fury, as Sarah refused to go down without a fight. In the end, however, the Astral Empire's might proved to be too great. Sarah's weapon ran dry, and she found herself on her knees, her body battered and broken, but her spirit unbroken. Evelyn stood over her, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "Any last words, girl?" The council member sneered, her finger poised on the trigger of her sidearm. Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile. "The fire you tried to extinguish has only grown brighter," she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people will never stop fighting. Your empire will fall, and the truth will be known." Evelyn's expression darkened, and she opened her mouth to deliver the final blow. But before she could act, a sudden commotion erupted nearby, drawing her attention away from Sarah. The rebel forces, buoyed by Sarah's defiant stand, had regrouped and launched a renewed assault, their determination fueled by the memory of their fallen comrades. Evelyn's gaze widened in alarm, as she realized that the battle was far from over. As the council member turned to flee, Sarah mustered the last of her strength, her hand reaching out to grasp Evelyn's ankle. "This is not the end," she whispered, her eyes burning with a fierce conviction. "The people will have their justice." Evelyn's face contorted with rage, and she kicked Sarah's hand away, her expression a mask of pure hatred. "We shall see about that," she spat, before disappearing into the chaos of the battle, leaving Sarah behind to face an uncertain fate. The streets of the Astral Empire's capital had descended into utter chaos as the rebel forces, emboldened by Sarah Washington's defiant last stand, launched a renewed assault against the Empire's elite shock troops. The air crackled with the sounds of blaster fire and the rumble of armored vehicles, as the two sides clashed in a desperate struggle for control of the city. Madame Evelyn, her expression a mask of fury, watched the unfolding events from a safe distance, her mind racing as she tried to devise a way to regain the upper hand. The rebels' tenacity and resolve had caught the council off guard, and she realized that their carefully orchestrated plan to crush the uprising was in danger of unraveling. As Sarah lay battered and broken on the ground, her eyes barely open, she caught a glimpse of the chaos unfolding around her. The rebel forces, fueled by her mother's memory and her own unwavering call to action, had refused to be cowed by the Empire's overwhelming might. They fought with a ferocity that seemed to defy the very laws of physics, their weapons blazing as they carved a path through the Imperial lines. Summoning the last vestiges of her strength, Sarah reached out, her fingers grasping at the hem of Evelyn's robe as the council member attempted to flee. "This is not the end," she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "The people will have their justice." Evelyn's face contorted with a mixture of rage and fear, and she wrenched her ankle free, her expression a mask of pure hatred. "We shall see about that," she spat, before disappearing into the chaos of the battle, leaving Sarah behind to face an uncertain fate. As the rebel forces surged forward, they caught sight of Sarah's prone form, and a collective gasp of horror and anguish ran through their ranks. Sarah Washington, the symbol of their resistance and the daughter of the slain Representative Alice Washington, lay defeated, her body battered and broken. A hush fell over the battlefield as the rebels gathered around their fallen leader, their eyes shining with tears of grief and anger. In that moment, they knew that the stakes had never been higher. The fate of the colonies and the legacy of all those who had sacrificed for the cause of freedom hung in the balance. Amidst the silence, a single voice rose up, its timbre clear and resolute. "For Alice," the rebel shouted, his fist raised high, and in an instant, the air was filled with the rallying cries of the people, their voices thundering across the capital like the roar of a mighty storm. The rebel forces, their spirits rekindled by the memory of their fallen comrades, surged forward with a renewed determination, their weapons blazing as they sought to break through the Imperial lines and reach the council chambers. Madame Evelyn, her face etched with a growing sense of panic, watched helplessly as the tide of the battle began to turn against the Astral Empire. In the council chambers, the remaining council members huddled together, their expressions a mixture of fear and resignation. They had not anticipated the depth of the people's resolve, nor the strategic acumen of the rebel forces. The Astral Empire's dominance, which they had once taken for granted, was now being challenged, and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. "We must act now, before this situation spirals completely out of control," Kiran, the council member who had advocated for the use of extreme measures, declared. "Deploy our full arsenal, orbital bombardments, bioengineered super soldiers, whatever it takes to crush this rebellion once and for all." The other council members exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions mirroring the gravity of the situation. They knew that the stakes had never been higher, and that the very foundation of the Astral Empire's power was being tested. But the people, Aisha, the more cautious council member, interjected. "If we resort to such extreme measures, we risk inciting even greater unrest. We must consider a more measured approach, one that addresses their grievances and restores a sense of stability." Evelyn, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and desperation, slammed her fist on the table, silencing Aisha's protests. "Stability," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. "The time for compromise has passed. The Astral Empire will not be held hostage by the whims of the masses. We will do whatever it takes to maintain our power, even if it means reducing this city to rubble." With a curt nod, Evelyn signaled the Imperial forces to unleash the full might of the Astral Empire's arsenal. The skies above the capital erupted in a blinding display of light and fire as powerful orbital bombardments rained destruction down upon the rebel strongholds, their devastating firepower tearing through the makeshift fortifications with ease. The rebels, caught off guard by the sudden onslaught, scattered in a desperate attempt to find cover, their ranks thrown into disarray. Sarah Washington, her eyes widening with horror, watched helplessly as her comrades were cut down one by one, their bodies consumed by the intense heat and energy of the orbital bombardment. As the flames licked at the edges of her vision, Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts consumed by the memory of her mother's sacrifice and the realization that the Astral Empire's grip on power was more tenuous than she had ever imagined. In that moment, she knew that the path to freedom would be paved with the blood of the people, and that the battle for the colony's future had only just begun. Summoning the last vestiges of her strength, Sarah reached out, her fingers grasping at the smoldering debris around her. With a determined gleam in her eyes, she whispered a single word, a rallying cry that would echo across the colonies and inspire the people to rise up against the tyranny of the Astral Empire. For Alice. As the words left her lips, the rebel forces, their spirits rekindled by the memory of their fallen comrades, surged forward once more, their weapons blazing as they sought to break through the Imperial lines and reach the council chambers. The battle for the Astral Empire's future had been joined, and the outcome would determine the fate of the colonies for generations to come.